Welcome to Keep Calm and Carry On, Crisis Communications Tips and Strategies. My name is Melanie Lockwood Herman. I'm Executive Director of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, and it's my pleasure to be your presenter for this program. You'll see on the first slide my phone number and also my email address. I encourage you to reach out to me if you have questions about any of the topics I'm going to cover today, or any crisis management or risk management topic you'd like to talk to somebody about. So feel free to reach out. Just as a reminder, the Nonprofit Risk Management Center is a nonprofit organization that works to inspire effective risk management across the nonprofit sector. Our goal is to help leadership teams become more comfortable with risk so that they can take more risk to advance the missions of their organizations. For today's workshop, I've got four sections. I want to start with resources today. And then I want to delve into what is crisis management and what is crisis communications. We'll share a few definitions. And then I want to focus most of my time with you on the topic of staying on message during a crisis, and then close with some final tips and takeaways. So let's start with resources that are available on nonprofitrisk.org. The first is a special issue of our magazine, Risk Management Essentials, called The Future is Now, Preparing for the Unknown Crisis. It's our crisis management issue. I hope you'll take a look at that. And then there's a second issue of the magazine that I thought was especially relevant to this topic. It's the Business Continuity Planning issue. So you'll see that on the screen in front of you on the right-hand side. Both are available at no charge at nonprofitrisk.org, and you want to go to the Resources tab to find these materials. And just as a reminder, as a community action agency, your agency is a member of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. There's no cost to you for that membership. I encourage you to set up an affiliate login on our website so that every time you go to nonprofitrisk.org, you'll have quick access to all the member benefits. When you click affiliate login, you'll have the opportunity to either log in directly or create an account. It's really easy to create an account on our website. And again, it will make it so much easier to find member resources when you come back to the website. As I mentioned at the beginning, I welcome your questions and follow-up issues on any risk-related topic. You can also use our risk help form, which is found on the website as well. It's a simple form. You fill in your name, your organization name, your email, and your phone number, and then you tell us the question that you have in mind. But feel free to call directly as well. Another reminder is that we've developed a very resourceful portal, if you will. We call it the Risk Management Portal, that was developed for community action agencies in partnership with the Community Action Partnership. And this is what the homepage of the portal looks like. And I'm hoping that many of you have already seen it and used it, perhaps used My Risk Assessment, which is one of the web applications featured on this site. To get to this website, you'll go to nonprofitrisk.org/CAP, and there's no charge to use this website. All right, let's turn to the topic at hand. Let's talk about crisis communications. Before we do that, let's revisit a definition of crisis. You may have seen the crisis management workshop that I delivered as well, where we went to this definition, looked at this definition. So this is from a Harvard Business Press publication called Managing Crisis. And the definition in that publication is a change, sudden or evolving, that results in an urgent problem that must be addressed immediately. So I underlined the words that really jumped off the page for me in this definition. The first being urgent problem. You know, when we think about a crisis event, it's not something that we're going to work on next week. It's not something that we can put off until next year. It's something that we have to handle right away. And really, that's the essence of a crisis. Here's another definition of crisis, and I like the way that there are a couple of different thoughts kind of brought together in this definition. An organizational crisis is a specific, unexpected, and non-routine event or series of events that create high levels of uncertainty and simultaneously present an organization with both opportunities for and threats to its high priority goals. This is a great definition, right? It combines the idea of a surprise, a threat, and a short response time. Now let's talk about crisis communications. So what do we mean when we use the term crisis communications? Well, I've chosen 3 definitions to share with you today. The first is from Wikipedia, a subspecialty of the public relations profession. The second is from a company called Rock Dove Solutions. They say that crisis communications is the technology, systems, and protocols that enable an organization to effectively communicate during an emergency situation. And then finally, from the Business Dictionary, the effort taken by a company to communicate with the public when an unexpected event occurs that could have a negative impact on a company's reputation. Well, my sense is that crisis communications is really kind of a combination of all of these things. So what about a crisis communications plan? That may be something that your agency aspires to create and have in place so that you'll be in the best position to respond when a crisis hits. My sense of this is that a crisis communications plan should have a number of components. I strongly believe that these plans should be customized to suit an agency, to suit your culture, to suit the scope of services that you offer, to suit your size, your leadership style, and so forth. But I think a great plan probably outlines, who are the spokespeople for the organization, who should be involved in a process of communicating in the middle of a crisis, who are the stakeholders who need to be kept in the loop, right? How do I reach key stakeholders in the organization in the middle of a crisis? And perhaps even some draft messages that can be tweaked to suit the crisis. And I think any good plan, whether it's a risk management plan or a business continuity plan or a crisis communications plan, includes contact information. So you've got names and phone numbers and email addresses right at hand when you need them. So what about your mission? How does mission impact crisis communications? A couple of additional thoughts, again, definitions, if you will. Crisis communications is mission-focused messaging and dialogue with vital stakeholders during a crisis. I really love this quote because it reminds us that in the middle of a crisis, we need to remember our mission. As nonprofit and public organizations, we need to remember our mission and live up to our mission and really double down on our mission, if you will, even though we're dealing with a crisis. So mission-focused messaging, I think that's really powerful. And then the second is crisis communications is informing your community with mission-focused messaging, inspiring confidence and comfort in times of crisis. I love this because, I do think when we're designing messages and communications pieces when we're in the middle of a crisis, we need to remember that we should be trying to inspire confidence, and we should also be comforting and empathetic, right, and caring. So now let's talk about how to stay on message during a crisis. And as we get into this topic, I want to remind you about these 3 categories of risk communication. So, we're talking about crisis communication kind of generally, but I love this article by Peter Sandman and Jody Leonard, and this goes back a few years, but I turn to this article over and over again. I love how they are explaining to us that there are different types of risk communications or crisis communications. So the first category they describe is precaution advocacy, right? And this is where we're alerting people to serious hazards and trying to get their attention. The second category they call outrage management. And this is where we're trying to reassure people, especially where there are minor hazards involved, and we don't want them to overreact, right? And then the third is what they call true crisis communication, where we're guiding people through serious hazards when they're appropriately upset, right? So in this framework, in the Sandman and Leonard framework, crisis communication is kind of a subset of risk communication, of general risk communication. I find this framework really helpful as I think about messaging and kind of what to do and what not to do in a crisis. I like to go back to this idea, am I trying to warn people? Am I trying to calm them down? Or am I trying to really guide them through some hazardous circumstances in a true crisis? So my first tip to kind of manage the message or staying on message during a crisis is to simplify the message. Simplify the message. So I've got three themes here. The first is I want you to remember to express the idea that we care, that your agency truly cares about people who have been injured, about people who've been negatively impacted by whatever the crisis event is, whether those individuals are clients and participants or board members or volunteers or your own employees, right? Or members of the community in which you operate. So it's incredibly important to express the idea that you care. Another message that I think is really important is we're here. We're here. We're open. We're available. We're working on this challenge or this crisis, and we're here. And then the third is, this is how you can help. Your people listening to those crisis communications messages that you're creating and publishing or broadcasting want to know, what can I do? How can I help you? And this is especially true in community serving organizations that have a lot of stakeholders who care deeply about what it is you do and your long-term success. So as you think about your crisis communications messages and staying on message during a crisis, I want you to think about who, what, and how. And I've created a little grid to help remind me about the different audiences, about what I'm going to say to those audiences, and about the means of reaching those audiences. So you can see in this grid, I've got who, what, how along the left-hand side, kind of in the first vertical column. And then across the top, I've started to list the audiences that I need to reach, my clients, my staff, donors, the general public, and the media perhaps. So you can have multiple audiences across the top. And then the next step is to fill in the blanks, right? So what does each audience need to hear? What does each audience need to know? And what will you say, right? And then finally, how will you reach these audiences? So I'd encourage you to think about creating a grid like this and having this ready to go. You know, you could already fill in the who categories across the top of the grid, right? Because you know the audiences that you're regularly communicating with, and you can imagine the audiences you would need to communicate with in a crisis. All right, the next step is to break down what to communicate. What will we say, right? What is it that we're going to communicate in these messages to all of these different stakeholder groups? So the first category of topics, if you will, is what I'm calling all about the event, right? And here's where you want to be speaking very specifically and thoughtfully as possible about the specific crisis event. Right. So if you're talking about COVID-19, you may be communicating some of the latest information from government and public health sources. If you're communicating about a severe storm that's coming towards your area, you might be sharing information from the National Weather Service or from other credible sources. And as you think about different types of crisis events that your organization might be facing in the future, I want you to start to think about who are those credible sources where you can get information that you can then share with your various stakeholder audiences. So that's kind of the all about the event. And then the second category that I want you to focus on as you create appropriate messages during a crisis, so I want you to focus on your agency, right? I want you to focus on what's happening, what you're doing to protect people, and how you believe your stakeholders, you know, are likely to be impacted by what's happening, by this crisis event that's upon you. In some cases, your response to crisis events may differ based on the type of crisis events or based on other circumstances beyond your control. But it is possible to start creating those messages now and kind of get them ready so that you only have to tweak them when the crisis occurs, that you're not having to start from scratch. So there's a really interesting book that I read earlier this year. It's called Questions Are the Answer. And it's by Hal Gregerson, who teaches at MIT. And I love the themes in the book about how we need to ask better questions rather than try to believe or aim to have all of the answers. And one of the things with respect to crisis communications that I think is really important is that you not be afraid to ask people, whether they are your staff, your clientele, visitors, and so forth, these different stakeholder groups. Don't be afraid to ask people, what do you need to feel safe or to feel safer, right? That may feel like it's putting you in this position of vulnerability. But what Gregerson explains to us is that when we're vulnerable with key stakeholders, it actually inspires confidence in our leadership. And Gregerson says it makes sense to remind yourself to admit and embrace being a little more wrong. Immerse yourself in situations where you feel less comfortable and ask more questions. So it's a great book. I highly recommend it. So as we think about messaging during a crisis and managing the crisis communications process, I want you to think about details, transparency, and questions. 3 really important topics. The first is, with respect to detail, you want to be providing enough detail to be informative without getting bogged down, right? You don't want to get bogged down in minutia and distract from the main messages, the critical messages that you're delivering. With respect to transparency, you want to be as transparent as possible. You know, what do you know about the situation? How did you come to certain decisions that you've made that impact your clientele, impact the community? And then make sure you are asking questions anytime you're delivering a message in a crisis, regardless of the audience. Make sure you're providing that opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions. And rather than jump to the script that you have and ready to go, make sure you're listening carefully to the questions you receive. Another important step to staying on message during a crisis is to clarify who is your agency's spokesperson. This is the person, or sometimes multiple people, who are authorized to speak on behalf of the organization. And they should be trained. There should be some practice sessions where they are practicing speaking, whether it be to the media, to the general public, to a gathering of staff, whatever those audiences are likely to be. So the spokesperson should practice. In many agencies, the appropriate spokesperson is the CEO or the executive director, but sometimes that person is not the right spokesperson. You know, if that person is very uncomfortable with public speaking, if that person gets super nervous when they're delivering a difficult message, if that person has a hard time going off script, right, and answering those questions that may pop up for which answers haven't been scripted, maybe your CEO or your executive director isn't the right person. So something else that you want to think about with respect to spokespeople is that anyone who is not a spokesperson should know it, right? You don't want people jumping up to speak on behalf of your organization if they haven't been authorized to do so or trained to do so. All right, this is an interesting article titled L&D Professionals Can Lead Through the Pandemic. So L&D stands for Learning and Development Professionals. And I thought these tips were really interesting. And this is from the Harvard Business Review. The first is to keep communication lines open and communicate regularly. Showing empathy, right? Focus on empathy, double down on empathy. Acknowledge emotions and concerns that you hear from people you're communicating with in the crisis. And then, of course, transparency, another really important element. And again, going back to we don't have all the answers. We'll never have all the answers. It's okay. It's okay to say we don't know the answer to that, right? We don't have that information. It really demonstrates humility, which is really, really important. Another tip, when you're in the spotlight, if you don't know, say so, and commit to finding out if that's feasible. So you can certainly say to an audience you're speaking to that, you know, I don't have the answer to that, but I'm going to try to get that answer. And hopefully by the time we meet again, I will have that answer for you. Make sure that you express sincerity and that you're compassionate, and not just about when people that you know have suffered an injury or there's been a tragedy involving people you know, but a tragedy in your community. Right? Be compassionate. Accommodate reasonable requests. If you're speaking to a media representative, they may want to do an interview with you in front of a damaged building, right? They might want to do an interview in a certain location to have that backdrop. It may feel uncomfortable to do that, but I would encourage you to try to accommodate those reasonable requests. And then lastly, sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we share incorrect information. Make sure that you're willing to admit when a mistake has been made. You can reestablish credibility when you do that and really build confidence in your leadership by doing that. So here's a list of the 5 C's. These are tips for, again, staying on message when you're communicating during a crisis. Demonstrate care. You care about the welfare of everybody involved in your agency, about the welfare of your community. You're committed to doing the best you can, to leading with your values, to helping people that need help, right? To getting back to normal in a reasonable amount of time. You're consistent. So if you promise you're going to deliver briefings on a weekly basis with a team or on a daily basis, you're keeping up with that. You're being consistent. Coherence, right? You're not just babbling about the crisis. You've actually given some thought to what you're going to say and how you're going to say it, and you've thought about how people might perceive the message. And then clarity, right? Things come together. You're trying to be as clear as possible. You're using plain language. You're not using too much jargon. You're not, using words that are familiar to the staff of your agency, but would be unfamiliar to the general public. So I think these 5 C's are really helpful reminders about how to stay on message. All right, now I want to close with some tips and takeaways. There was an interesting article in the Harvard Business Review not too long ago by Nancy Cohn. It's called "Real Leaders Are Forged in Crisis." And it's a terrific read, so I encourage you to look that up and read the full article. But I've included on this slide a quote from the author where she talks about your job as a leader is to provide brutal honesty. She says that's a clear accounting of the challenges that you're facing and credible hope, right? That you have the resources that are needed to meet those threats, to overcome this challenge that you're facing. And really love the intersection of those two ideas, brutal honesty and credible hope. And I think the best messages from leaders in a crisis really demonstrate both of those. I want to encourage you to be patient and forgiving. When you're in a crisis, there will be some things you're experiencing for the first time. There's a tremendous amount of stress. Expectations are high. And you might make a decision that doesn't work out. You might make a mistake. You might direct your team to do something that you have to pull back. So I want you to be patient and forgiving with everybody in your circle, right? Everybody on your team at your agency, but also be patient and forgiving with yourself. And realize that a crisis is something you're going to get through, but it's also an opportunity for learning. And then also remember to pay attention to both energy and emotion during a crisis. And again, this quote on the slide is from that article, "Real Leaders Are Forged in Crisis." And she writes that, crises take a toll on all of us. They're exhausting. They can lead to burnout. They can be devastating. And she says, one of the things that leaders must do is to keep their fingers on the pulse of the team's energy and emotions and respond as needed. Some members of your team will need extra support during a crisis. Some will handle it very, very well. They're accustomed to crisis events, but many will need that extra support. And then from Ethical Crisis Leadership, a SAGE Publications piece, just wanted to remind you that we don't build character during a crisis. Essentially, the character of an organization is exposed during a crisis. And so, those values kind of come to the forefront and the public sees you for what you are. So really, really important to remember openness, honesty, responsibility, accountability, trustworthiness with your stakeholders in the time leading up to a crisis and also in the middle of a crisis. Such important values. And those values, if you've lived them throughout your organization's history, those values will serve you well when you're in the middle of a crisis. And then one more tip, practice humble leadership. And this idea comes from 2 books that I had a chance to read earlier this year. The first one is called What Philosophy Can Teach You About Being a Better Leader. And, the authors write that how you show up as a vulnerable, fallible leader who doesn't have all the answers, do you permit others to do the same? No leader has all of the answers. And Hal Gregerson reminds us that sometimes we don't ask questions because we're not comfortable with the information we're going to get in return. So humility in the middle of a crisis is so important, and it's such an important aspect of effective crisis communications. So if you think about some humble questions you might be asking yourself and your team during a crisis, I'd start with, whose perspective do I need, or whose different perspective, whose perspective is missing? How do I make sure that surprising information or even bad news flows to me, right? Is there anything happening in the culture of the organization such that people don't want to give me bad news? They don't want to call me and tell me that something has gone terribly wrong. How can I get people to tell me I'm wrong? You know, as a leader, you'll make some great decisions, you'll make some ill-informed decisions, but once in a while, you're going to be wrong. And if your team is afraid of you or fearful of bringing you bad news or telling you you're wrong, you will potentially go down that wrong path for a very long distance before getting it right. You know, what am I forgetting to ask about or failing to ask about? And how do I encourage the probing of assumptions in every corner of the organization? You know, we all know what assumptions, how detrimental assumptions can be, or making assumptions can be. So how do we probe assumptions? How do we question assumptions as a team? And then finally, the last tip is to stay future focused and positive. You know, when you're in the middle of a crisis, when you're trying to communicate effectively in the middle of a crisis and you're facing that current challenge, it's really hard to look off into the distance, into the future, but you have to be future focused, right? You know, there's always a silver lining to every crisis event. And we need to, you know, remind ourselves over and over again of the good things.